I want to welcome to the program now Gregory Wrightstone, Executive Director of the CO2 Coalition. So, Greg, thanks for being with us, and tell the viewers more about the CO2 Coalition, your background, and your members.
Yeah, the CO2 Coalition is a nonprofit based in Arlington, Virginia. We're a science-based group. We have more than 70 of some of the top climate scientists, atmospheric physicists, climatologists, engineers, and energy experts dealing with climate change. And we all agree that what we're seeing today, the modest warming combined with increasing CO2, is actually leading to an Earth's ecosystems that are thriving and prospering, and humanity and the human condition are improving. We're not spiraling into one climate catastrophe after the other. There is no climate crisis. We see by almost every metric you look at, life and ecosystems are improving. Much of what we're being told is just, to borrow a Facebook term, it's false and misleading. And that was used in this regional greenhouse gas initiative report. They relied on this misleading and false information to justify why Pennsylvania needed to be into this carbon cap and trade system.
You recently testified before the General Assembly about that report. How did the report come to be?
I knew a lot about RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and I enlisted the help of the many scientists that we have here and experts at the coalition. I was the lead author of this study. To bolster that, we had other experts that we could bring in dealing with things like the reputed sea level rise. It's going to overwhelm Philadelphia. We brought in agronomists and dairy experts to combat the idea of a looming agricultural catastrophe for Pennsylvania. In each case, we showed just the opposite.
The report had three major parts and then a conclusion. You were the author of the first part. It deals with the analysis by the Wolf administration, their predictions of climate catastrophes. What did you find?
Yeah, actually, I enjoyed doing that. It was pretty fun. It was because it was, as I know a lot about it, and they listed 7 justifications. This is why these things are going to happen and are happening, is what they stated. These are the 7 things. And I knew from doing this before researching this that they were just wrong. So we got into, the first was increasing precipitation. That man-made climate change is going to increase precipitation and lead to the devastating flooding, just like we saw in 2018. It is true 2018 had significant floods. 2018 precipitation actually was record-setting. It was unusual in that regard. But when you look at what the governor did, he made a mistake of conflating weather with climate. You can't take a one-off event like one rainstorm, one hurricane, or 1 year of additional precipitation. You have to look into the big picture. So he looked at precipitation and flooding. Well, I took a look at flooding records from around the state. Well, there are many hundreds of stations that gauge floods. I chose 5 of them that represented the Susquehanna, the Allegheny, the Ohio, the Mon. There was one other I can't recall, Schuylkill, and to show that the floods, and actually the flood crests, have been decreasing, not increasing. Is there an increase in precipitation? Yes, there's a slight increase in precipitation since 1900, 4 inches. Well, that equals about 1/3 of an inch per month, which is nothing more than a nice passing rain shower that will moisten the fields even better. So that slight increase in precipitation is probably a good thing, certainly much better than a severe drought. And then number 2, you can't make this stuff up. Number 2, after increasing precipitation, was increasing drought. Drought is increasing, and it's going to get worse.
How's that possible? They can't both be true at once.
Exactly. He should have just picked one and stuck with it. You can't have increasing precipitation and increasing drought. I mean, just any rational person could look at that and go, what? And we showed that drought is actually decreasing categorically. It's just categorically false. We looked at the Palmer Drought Severity Index for Pennsylvania to show that, according to this scientific study that we got from NOAA, drought is decreasing in Pennsylvania, not increasing. And there was a whole litany of these things. He said that in the report they justified it. They said that sea level is increasing significantly and will impact Philadelphia and southeast Pennsylvania because the Schuylkill River there is tidally driven in Philadelphia. Well, we looked at the records. There's been no increase in sea level rise. It's rising today at the same rate as it was 120 years ago. If so-called man-made climate change and warming was actually increasing sea level rise, you should see an acceleration. And we just don't see that at Philadelphia or really anywhere. Every metric we could look at in terms of agriculture showed just the opposite. We see just a stunning increase in various crop growth year after year after year after year, highly correlated to increasing CO2. Because as you know, and I'm sure many of your viewers know, that CO2 drives plant growth. It's when you have photosynthesis, you need water, you need light, you need CO2, and the more CO2, the better.
The second section of your report analyzed the Wolf administration's flawed use of climate and CO2 emission models. Can you walk us through that, please?
Yeah, that was done by Dr. Patrick Michaels. Again, he was past president of the American State Climatologist Association. He did a detailed analysis and found that the report they relied on used what's called CMIP 8.5. Basically, it's the climate emission pathway. How much CO2 will be produced in the future? And they used the most extreme, radical, unlikely scenario of how much CO2 is going to be emitted in the future. So they used this implausible, is actually what it was called by people that have studied this, an implausible CO2 emission standard. And then they compounded that error by using the wrong climate sensitivity. Now, by that, I mean, how much warming will a doubling of CO2 create? And that's how we look at this. Okay, if we're at 400 now, if we got to 800, how much warming could we expect from that? And from that, they came up with this, again, implausibly high number of the amount of warming that we could see. He went back and looked at the models. There's a robust 100 plus various climate models that are used. 99 of the 100 were wildly incorrect and over-predicted warming. They over-predicted warming by 2.5 times too much and 3 times too much in the tropics. We can be sure that it will be economically harmful to the state, what they're proposing with increasing this. What we aren't sure of at all is what they're proposing in terms of the amount of warming.
So we understand that the purpose of this carbon tax scheme under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is meant to make less competitive electricity generation from natural gas and coal. So what environmental benefit would come to Pennsylvania if this carbon tax was put in place?
If you believe that carbon dioxide emissions are driving temperatures, Dr. Michaels looked at that. What would this do? We've looked at it. If we reduced all carbon dioxide emissions in the United States, it would only avert 0.04 of a degree centigrade by the year 2050. 0.04, we can't even measure that. That's all. This is using their own numbers. 0.04 of a degree centigrade. That's what we're going to do. We're going to put people out of work, tens of thousands of people out of work. You're going to increase the electricity costs for Pennsylvanians and it's much less than 0.04 of a degree centigrade for just if it's just Pennsylvania. So we're talking about doing something, even using their own numbers, that won't, any changes to temperature would be far below what we could actually measure.
And of course, the economic damage would be widespread because every other part of the economy depends on, being powered. And certainly that's the case in manufacturing. We're the sector that adds the most value, but every stage of production requires energy inputs. In fact, for many manufacturers, that energy is the number one cost input to their process. So raising energy prices That will dampen manufacturing. Manufacturing, of course, is the engine that drives our economy. That would be a big drag on our economy overall.
That's right. If you're a widget manufacturer in Indiana, Pennsylvania, if this is impacted and passed and impacts and your electricity costs go up, you may well consider moving that widget factory to a non-RGGI state. Move it to Ohio, Pennsylvania, somewhere where you make your widgets at a much lower cost.
Well, and the last time that I checked, that the jet stream still blows from west to east, and so if you have increased emissions in Ohio and West Virginia, all that's going to get blown right back here into the Commonwealth.
That's right. But CO2 is mainly global in nature. It gets distributed around. I've been learning a lot more. We're doing a study right now on nutrition and CO2, and it's fascinating when you look at this. I just did it last week in a cornfield. If you go in with the CO2 meter, before you get in the cornfield and you measure CO2, it was at about 500 parts per million. I walked into the field. Well, heck, it dropped to 350 parts per million. And that's because that corn is just sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and drops in the middle of the cornfield. The CO2 levels drop. It was fascinating.
Yes.
But that's just example. And again, our agronomists were telling us on a very still day in a cornfield, CO2 levels just plummet during the day. So which one is a balmy day to spread the CO2 so the corn grows better? And I just learned that this week. It was fascinating.
Greg, why do you think there's so much alarmism on these issues? Who benefits from people being afraid of highly unlikely outcomes?
I get asked that a lot. And I think different people have different motivations. We at the CO2 Coalition try to stay out of the politics. And so it's difficult. If you're a scientist and you do something or promote a paper that you've written that opposes man-made warming, we've seen time and time again, you lose your funding. You want to keep getting $1 million or $2 million a year in funding, keep writing the papers with the correct conclusion. They're not doing the research and then writing the paper. They're starting in so many cases with a conclusion and then fitting the facts around it. I think the answer, you're asking me, why are they lying to us, to be a little bit cruder. And I will tell you that you and Carl and everyone else watching are just as qualified as I am to say why they're doing it. I can provide the science, the facts, and the data that says, okay, this is what they're telling you, okay, and here's what the science actually shows.
Well, Greg, we appreciate you taking time to talk with us for the report that you issued, and for viewers who want to learn more. Where can they go to find out more about you, your work, and the CO2 Coalition?
We go to co2coalition.org. Look up who we are, and you'll be amazed at some of the men and women that make up the CO2 Coalition. Just amazing people, really smart people, a lot smarter than I am. You can get our papers there and download them. So co2coalition.org would be a great place to go.
Outstanding. Greg Wrightstone, Executive Director of the CO2 Coalition, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.